there's something in me that probably comes, if anywhere, from the fact that my father was a surrealist artist. And he just didn't see things necessarily the way they were immediately presented. And that goes with surrealism. And to me, I struggle to see a rule without seeing the questions behind, why does that rule exist? What would happen if it didn't exist?
Hello and welcome to Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Hough, and I'm delighted that you're joining us as we get between the vines with some of the best wine writing out there. So sit back, pour yourself a glass, and enjoy the show with the Italian Wine Podcast.
This month, you join us behind the scenes at 5 Star Wines in Verona, where our guest today is Robert Joseph. Robert is a leading figure in the international wine community, and I am delighted that he's found some time in his incredibly busy day to chat to us about his prolific career as a wine writer, consultant, producer, and industry analyst. Robert, your Wikipedia entry describes you as a wine connoisseur. Is that something that you always aspired to be?
No, and it's a word that I think Wikipedia comes up with and I don't particularly like, but it does differentiate me from one or two other Robert Josephs there might be out there, including an American politician. Connoisseur is one of those words that kind of separates people who know about wine from everybody else, and I don't like it. Don't actually like wine expert very much either, but I guess if you've been doing it for long enough and you get invited to come along and judge at events like this 5 Star Wines tasting, I guess you probably are more of an expert than the average person out there drinking wine. But I think wine is full of barriers that set the people who know about wine on the one side from the people who drink wine on the other. And I've never really felt very comfortable with that. But having said that, I've always wanted to be one of those people who knew a bit about wine.
How would you describe yourself? How would you describe your job?
That's the problem. Basically, how do you don't actually, at a dinner party, somebody says to you, what are you doing? You say, I'm a wine expert. There's no way you're going to do that. So you kind of say, I work in wine. And in my case, it's a little bit more tricky than it is for a lot of people, because I'm a jack of several trades, if you like. So I produce wine, I write about the business of wine, and I do consulting, and I write books and so on. But I used to be a wine critic. Fortunately, I'm no longer a wine critic, because when having started to make wine, I didn't think that was appropriate. But I still have a great deal of feeling for some of my colleagues and friends who still are wine writers, and it's not an easy job to do.
And so where did this interest in wine first originate? I've heard stories about stamp collecting and an Italian maitre d' called Mario and a 6-year stint in the University of Life.
You've done your research very well. So very simply, I was an only child and grew up, my parents had a hotel and restaurant, and I got interested in all these bottles of wine, which had labels that reminded me of the stamps that I was then collecting. So that was the parallel. I wondered, every stamp has a story. Where's it come from? What is it? Where is Sri Lanka, or where is Ghana, or whatever these stamps were? And then, why was this label gold and this one black and this one had a tower or a castle or whatever on it? So that was the background to wine, and I was very lucky because we had a maitre d'. We didn't have a sommelier in those days. Not everybody, a lot of restaurants, smart restaurants that you might have thought would have had sommeliers and would today, didn't in those days. But we had a maitre d' called Mario who saw that I had a bit of an interest, and he kept giving me samples of what people had left in the bottom of the bottles. And he was genuinely, he's one of those people who was genuinely passionate about wine. And I've been thinking about this recently for a book I've been writing. And he was one of those people who, when he was tasting wine, you could actually see that he was going somewhere else. And when I thought about it, it was like actually talking to your grandmother or grandfather about something. You realize that they're no longer actually here in the room with you. They're actually somewhere 20, 30, 40, 50, however many years ago, in their minds. And for him, that would happen sometimes with a glass of wine. And I didn't understand that at the time, but today I do understand it. And it's something that some wines can do. Not very many, but some can do that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I've had that kind of conversation with a few people recently, where the sense that wine is stimulating something beyond just what you're drinking. It triggers in the way that a smell can, or
I think, look, I mean, Proust and the Madeleine is the obvious line, and and melodies, and as you say, smells and whatever. The brain is responds to all sorts of senses, and I think that we're ready to be. You'll see someone in a crowd who reminds you of someone. You'll hear just a few bars of a melody, and something will do it. And wine will do that.
Yeah. Can you imagine your life or your career without wine? As an alternative to asking the question, how did you get into wine? What would you have done if you hadn't discovered the world of wine, do you think?
That, again, is a very good question. And, I'm one of those people who, when I travel a lot, too much probably, and I have a kind of, I guess, maybe promiscuous, I don't know what to say, but, when I'm in Shanghai or Vienna or wherever, there is part of me that goes, could I live here, in an alternative universe? Could I just stop living where I do and start living here? And there's part of me that goes, yeah, I could, or I couldn't, or whatever. So there's part of me that says, yeah, I could have been a lawyer or a journalist or in advertising or whatever. So yes, I could. I think I'm not sure that wine was the right thing for me to have chosen, to be really blunt. But then I'm not sure that if any of those other things would have been the right thing either. There's something in me that probably comes, if anywhere, from the fact that my father was a surrealist artist. And he just didn't see things necessarily the way they were immediately presented. And that goes with surrealism. And to me, I struggle to see a rule without seeing the questions behind, why does that rule exist? What would happen if it didn't exist? And that would apply in all sorts of things. So if you're a lawyer, I guess that's what you do every day. In advertising, you're saying, how can we sell this bar of soap or this car or whatever? How do we play on the emotions of the people who see the advertisement or whatever? And that has always fascinated me. And I think in wine, one of the dangers in wine is that we get very, very bogged down in the terroir and the soil and all the rest. And the thing about wine that's fascinating is that it's an emotional, convivial product, that people actually sit around and enjoy together and get drunk and argue and fall in love, and all sorts of things happen through wine, and they're emotionally driven things. And yet, when we talk about wine, we end up talking about chalk and gravel and barrels from Allier or wherever, and all that sort of stuff. And to me, there's a bit of a disconnect, if you like, between these two sides. And the bit that affects why people buy the wine they do and how they drink it, when they drink it, that has increasingly fascinated me. Over and above the, why it tastes the way it does. We're supposed to believe that, and I'm sorry, you probably interview winemakers for this, in this booth all the time, but I'm not sure that winemakers are any more interesting than bakers or fishermen or butchers or gardeners or whatever. And specifically, they're taking grapes and turning them into wine. Some of them are absolutely fascinating people. Some of them are really boring.
Yeah.
But it's what happens to the product they make that really, and the sense of artists. There are some really boring artists.
Yes.
But, the effect that the canvas or the sculpture they make has on people.
Yeah, that's a very well-made point. And would we sit week after week and interview people who produce tea, for example, or produce coffee? Perhaps one day, but
I can't see why coffee should be less interesting than wine. And one of the things that fascinates me about the wine industry is the obsession that wine people have with terroir and where wine comes from and so on. And then they all go out and have a cup of coffee from a machine or from wherever that comes from an espresso pod. And you say to them, which country was it from, which region? And they've got no idea. And if you say, actually, I'm going to make a wine blending grapes from Spain and France, they look at you as if you were proposing something completely aberrant. But they'll do that with tea or coffee.
Yeah. So you do see these kind of idiosyncrasies or hypocrisies, if you like, in the wine industry, but you spent an entire career, a lifetime almost, observing and writing about the wine industry. You began, I think, as the wine correspondent for the Sunday Telegraph for 16 years, from the mid-1980s to the early 2000s, which is a pretty seismic period in world affairs, but perhaps not by today's standards.
And I think, again, I was very lucky. I was in the UK, and I've always said between 1985 and 2000, and that sort of period sort of kind of overlap with when I was a wine writer for the Sunday Telegraph, was what I call the summer of love of wine. And it was an extraordinary time. And it was, you can actually go back and say, this is a time when we started to see Australian wines and Chilean wines and New Zealand wines and South Africa, because of apartheid, came a bit later. But and obviously California. Coming into the UK, we had a number of very, very dynamic retailers and importers in the UK. And the UK was the centre. And the fact was that the London International Wine Trade Fair, which is what it was called, you go around there and you'd hear American accents and Swedish accents, and people come from all over the world to London to find out what was happening in the wine world. And so we were just lucky for about 15 years to be in the heart of the storm. There are moments like that. I'm sure that people say that London is that for the video gaming world. I don't know how true that is, but there are certain places, the Hamilton song, to be in the room where something's happening. Well, London and the UK, but London specifically, was the room in which wine was happening.
And to what extent were you an observer of that process, and to what extent were you a shaper or an influencer, to use that word, as a correspondent, long-standing correspondent on a broadsheet?
Very tough question to ask. I think what wine critics do, and their role is very, very complicated, in the sense that I wrote for a newspaper that came out every Sunday and had, I think, 250,000 or whatever it was, copies, and then they multiplied it up and said every copy is read by X number of people. And if you did it right, you'd say, oh God, 1 million people or whatever could be reading what I wrote. Actually, you knew that actually a tiny proportion of people actually read what you wrote in the newspaper. However, what you did know, that of that number of people, that would have included all of the importers and the retailers and other critics and so on. And the same thing applied to everyone else who's writing. So if I went, and I was with Oz Clarke, one of the first people to go to Australia in those days, what we wrote didn't drive an awful lot of people to go out and buy Australian wines, but it did help to prompt, I guess, a number of retailers to think, oh, we should look at Australia. Then the next time the people like us wrote about it, we were writing, hey, there's Australian wine in this store and that store. And so it became self-propagated, if you like. So I think we were part of it. I think in the case of any movement, and with social media, you really see that, where you start the ball rolling, other people pick it up, and then you pick up what the other people have picked up. So very hard to say. But I think what was true then, and probably isn't true today, was that the people you could think about as being UK wine writers of those days, and Jancis Robinson, Tim Atkin, Oz Clarke, myself, and a few others, we knocked around quite a lot with the buyers and some of the key importers and so on. And so, we were back to my Hamilton reference, we were in the room. I don't think that's true now. I think that the way wine is bought by the big retailers is very different today, and I don't think the wine writers of today have that kind of asset.
Yeah, the room has got bigger and there are more people in the room.
Yeah, I think so.
During that same period, you launched the magazine Wine International and the London International Wine Challenge. So talking about these wine competitions, what in your view is the purpose or the value of these kind of events? What do they offer the consumer and or the producer?
I think the competitions, again, we started the International Wine Challenge, the IWC, in 1984 by accident. It was an article in the magazine that we were doing, which set English wines against wines from other countries, and English wines did surprisingly well, way before there were English sparkling wines and the wave that we know today. And that then led to what became a competition that grew from 50-odd wines in the first iteration up to, I think, 10,000, 12,000 when it was at its peak. I think, again, back to what I was saying earlier in terms of what critics do, it's hard to quantify whether you're giving the wine a gold medal in that competition is what matters, or what people then do with the gold medal they've had. So if they enter the wine and they get a gold medal and they tell people they've had a gold medal and they put the gold medal on the label, people buy that wine, and maybe they've never bought a wine from that country before, and they buy another wine from that country. So the snowball effect is very, very hard to quantify, but I think it certainly happens. And today you see, I'm doing some consultancy. I've done some consultancy for Moldova, for example. Moldova believes they enter quite a few competitions, and they're every year they're saying we've got more medals. What does that mean? Well, it does mean the average quality of Moldovan wine has gone up. Yeah, there's no question. And when they're going to see retailers, they say, "Hey, give us a break, because look," and that probably does have a value. But some competitions are definitely more influential than others. We are here at the 5-Star Wines, which is not technically a competition, but effectively behaves as one, if you like. And there's a book that comes out, which is called 5-Star Wines, the book. And then people who want to buy good examples of Italian wine will buy that book or get that book and see examples that offer, this is what a Mazzamino should taste like, or this is what an Etna, a white, should taste like.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the book, because this is the book club after all. And is that a unique offering of this wine competition, that it has that tangible book at the end of it, rather than simply just a list or a catalogue or a website?
When we had Wine International magazine, the results of the International Wine Challenge went into that magazine. Decanter certainly publishes the Decanter Award, so magazines do it. In terms of books, I think this is unusual in having a book, and I think what's nice about a book is it will potentially remain on somebody's shelf for a long time, where magazines end up in the bottom of a cage somewhere with a hamster and a wheel above.
And I mean, just to go back to this idea that perhaps wine is different to coffee or tea or beer or whiskey, do we judge beer or whiskey in the same way, or is this something that's unique to wine?
I think beer tasters definitely judge beer in the same way, and I think the beer tasters take beer championships and awards very, very seriously.
But I don't think I would base my decision to buy a beer on a point awarded by someone or on a prize from a competition, would I?
Not necessarily, but I'm not sure how many people in going out to buy a bottle of wine in Italy or Germany or France necessarily are doing so today in terms of wine. So I think in the States, definitely point scores have worked very highly. We take scores highly when it comes to TripAdvisor, to Amazon, in other spheres. And I think, even in terms of theatre plays and books and music, we tend to think that wine is more special to other people than maybe those people think it is.
Okay. And you mentioned again 5-Star Wines and the book that comes out of that. One of the things about 5-Star Wines is it gives you this snapshot of the vast diversity of Italian wine. Can you tell us, are you seeing any emerging trends? I know this is just day one.
I mean, I think that we're seeing year on year, there's definitely less new oak being used. There's definitely a lighter touch in various ways that you can see. But I don't think you need to be very careful, because you'll hear people tell you that young people today want lighter, fresher wines. And then you go out and find that a wine called XXL in the US has just sold 40 million bottles of wine from zero in 2 years. And it has 16% alcohol, so it's fortified effectively, and it's fruit flavored and it's sweet. It doesn't conform to any of the rules that people have told you that young people want, and it's very targeted at young people. So I think, there isn't one trend in wine. I think we need to be very careful about that. And there are lots of different, it's a river I won't say necessarily the stream is going in two directions at once, but it's certainly not all going in the same direction, the same speed. But yeah, we definitely see, and I think what's interesting is we're seeing regions and styles and grades. I've just tasted a Viognier from Lazio, which is probably not a conjunction of words that I might have put together 10 years ago. And it was very good.
Okay. So we're seeing, if not new products and new ways of...
Yeah, and new products and new ways.
Yeah. Okay, great. And still 3 days to go, so everything to play for.
Yeah.
Okay. Switching gear slightly, I want to talk about your involvement in the production of wine.
Yeah.
And so in 2005, you moved into wine production and co-created Le Grand Noir, an innovative French brand, which now sells nearly 4 million bottles a year. In 2024, you launched the Georgian wine called
Caceres. Very good.
Caceres. Okay.
Which means coming together in Georgia.
Okay. As a producer, and feel free just to give us a bit of background and a bit of context from both of these projects that you're involved in. What I really want to ask is, as a producer, what are your biggest challenges that you're facing at the moment?
There are two challenges. One is climate change makes wine production more difficult than it has been in the past, but it's never been that easy. But, now each year is even more different in some ways. And then on the other hand, you have to sell the stuff. And in this world, people are drinking less wine every year than they were the year before. So, to be blunt, if I sell a bottle of wine, that's probably a bottle of wine that somebody else isn't selling. I'm not necessarily turning people onto wine from whatever else they were drinking before. So that, those are two challenges. And because I write a column every week called The Devil's Advocate in Meininger's International, in which my role there is to question the status quo. And in my winemaking is literally, when I say winemaking, if you look at my hands, you can tell I'm not actually the winemaker, but wine production, working with very skilled winemakers. What I'm trying to do is turn some of the things, the ideas that I've expressed in newspaper and magazine articles into 3 dimensions in the shape of tanks and bottles of wine. So in one sense, what I'm doing in France, what we started doing in France, as you said, 20 years ago, was to produce New World style branded wines in Languedoc. So we had all these wines, we had these Chardonnays and Cabernets and Pinot Noirs and Sauvignon Blancs that came from all those New World countries. And we didn't see them from France or anywhere else in Europe very much. And I said, why couldn't we? Why shouldn't we? And so we went out and found a set of cooperatives down in Languedoc who had 6,000 hectares of vines. And we put a Cabernet Syrah, and Cabernet Shiraz, it's called in time, and a Chardonnay Viognier out to the market that did well. And then, other, as I said, Pinot Noirs and Sauvignon Blancs and so on followed. And these have been wines that have had, whatever success we've had is not dissimilar to the success that some of those Californian and Australian, New Zealand, Chilean wines have had. And basically, they're incredibly easy to see on a shelf and understand. And I hope they're incredibly easy to enjoy, because you don't have to keep them for a long time and have them with this food or that food or whatever. And because of the name and there's a black sheep on the label, they're incredibly easy to recognize and buy again if you can see them on the same shelf on another day. And that, if you get that right, then you've got a regular customer, which is exactly the same as you'd have with a beer or jam or anything else. And a lot of wine people don't like to see themselves as being compared to beer or jam, but yeah, we are. If you're on sale in a supermarket, then that's what happens. My Georgian wine, which is, as you just said, literally we really started doing it. We released our first wine last year after effectively 5 years of experimentation. Is totally opposite, because it's got a name, Caceres, that nobody's going to be able to understand. They can just about pronounce it, I guess. And then they turn the label around, and they can see the back labels, a whole list of grapes they can't recognize. And it's got what a lot of traditional wines have got, which has got "Go Away" written all over it. Most Italian wines have got "Go Away" written. The only difference in terms of my Georgian Go Away wine and all the Italian go-away wines is that I know it's got go-away on it. Basically part of what we're doing is factoring in the fact that sommeliers and other people, specialist wine retailers and so on, are going to have to present it to people and get them to try it, because they're not going to pick it up and try it themselves. Whereas a number of Italian producers think that having created a new DOC or DOCG last week, that's going to work, that people are suddenly is going to pick up their wine from wherever that region is. Actually, I don't think my Georgian wine is necessarily that much more handicapped than a new DOC from southern Italy.
Yeah. And Caceres, it's one of those words you look at and you think, oh my God, how am I going to tackle this? But actually, it's not that bad.
The Georgian language is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And we spent a long time choosing words and looking at words that worked. But it actually has a reason for existing, which is that Caceres means it's come together in Georgian. And there's an awful lot of coming together involved in it. So firstly, there is a very cool young Georgian superstar winemaker, and there's a fat, aging former wine critic, which is me, from Britain. So it's 2 different countries, 2 different, everything there. We're making wine with 10 different grape varieties from 2 different regions for the white, 4 different regions for the red, the rosé. And people say, oh, you're making, obviously, you're Georgia, you must be making a Glenfiddich amphora wine. No, well, yes and no. Basically, 9 or 10% of it is made in a Glenfiddich in the ground. Another 5% is made with skin contact in stainless steel. But why are you doing that? I'm actually using the same old Georgian technique, but in a modern way. And then we've got some stainless steel fermentation and some barrels, none of which is interesting to the average person, but it means that it's got a Georgian character, but it isn't the full-on Georgian straight out of the ground amphora model. And then we're blending vintages. And, we're blending 4 different vintages in the case of the white. And people go, why are you doing that? And my answer is, why not? Champagne does it. Why shouldn't we do it? So this year at Vinitaly, we're doing a tasting for, I think, only 25 people, but we'll have Vega Sicilia from Ribera del Duero in Spain, Cade vineyards from California, Napa, Caballo Loco from Valdivieso in Chile, and Rodera collection, and and Pascua's Hay French, and all of these are multi-vintage wines. The thing is, there aren't very many multi-vintage vintage wines in the world, and you say, why? There's lots of champagne, so why aren't there many still wines? And by the same token, our red wine, we've got a red wine where we co-ferment black grapes and white grapes. And you ask people, say, well, where does that happen? They say, well, it happens in Côte Rôtie in the Rhone. Okay, where else does it happen? Australia, where they're copying Côte Rôtie in the Rhone. But why would you not actually put black and white grapes into the same vat and ferment them together? We've proven it works. Côte Rôtie proves it works. So I think now is the time. What's exciting about living in wine in right now in the 2020s is that it's a time where I think a lot of experimentation is beginning to happen.
Yeah. And yes, these are certainly exciting times to be involved in the production of wine. But the debate I was leaving out for you when I was asking about the biggest challenges currently facing the industry, which you very carefully, I think, avoided, was this question of tariffs, which is a very topical issue at the moment. But we're recording this at the beginning of April, where we're currently under the shadow of a potential 200% tariff on European wine. What's your take on that?
Well, it's fascinating because on one hand, my French wine business we sell a lot of wine in America, and actually having a 200% tariff, which is still possible, would be pretty horrendous. And we had a 25% tariff from Trump when he was last in, so we know what it feels like. But it would be, whatever it is, 8 times worse than that. On the other hand, does that mean that lots of people are going to buy my Georgian wine if there aren't any tariffs on Georgia and there are on Europe? And the thing we don't know is where is in favor and where is not in favor at any given moment. So South Africa could feel in favor if it weren't for the fact that the US administration doesn't like South Africa at the moment. Australia could definitely be in favor. Who knows? I just think that it's just not very comfortable to be in a world where we just don't know from one week to the next. And even if,
from one day to the next, even.
Yeah, and even if the tariffs don't come in or do come in or come in part or whatever, we just don't know in six weeks' time, 6 months or whatever, that they're not going to be changed in some way. So I think that it's a very, very, these are febrile times, I think is the expression I'd use.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the subject of this febrility, if that's the correct word, I wanted also to ask you about the febrile world of social media. You mentioned devil's advocate and your role as questioning the status quo. And I think it's fair to say that you are active and sometimes outspoken on social media.
I think what's scary is there are two separate things. I mean, I think cults, I've never been a joiner. I had to join a journalist union at one time because I was kind of obliged to do so. But I really, unions do an awful lot of good. Don't get me wrong, but very often they're run by the wrong people and do maybe the right thing, but in the wrong ways. And I've never really, I've never seen much appeal in most political parties or religious organizations or whatever. Wine is a cult. There are an awful lot of people who joined the cult of wine, and you say wine isn't very healthy. Oh, yes, it is. Whatever. And I have to say that MAGA and Trump, it's a cult. And the moment you have cults, it means that you just cannot have a rational conversation. You cannot say, you might be 55% right and the other guys are 45% right or whatever, or vice versa. And that's, I think, the biggest problem at the moment. I get why an awful lot of people did not want to vote for Biden or then Harris and then did vote for Trump. But then I don't get why they then are treating Trump as though he were the Messiah. And I get why people prefer wine to spirits or beer, but I don't get why they then refuse to acknowledge some of the undeniable downsides to wine that we have to put on the balance sheet against the positives. So social media, which I used to be in Twitter, I've got 34,000 in theory. I don't know if I've got them still, but I did have 34,000 followers on Twitter. But, Twitter is not a very nice place to be now. I'm not sure that Facebook, I've given up more some Facebook. I use LinkedIn a lot. I find it very useful in terms of if anyone wants to find out what I've written, they'll find it through LinkedIn.
The nature of the discourse seems to be passive-aggressive rather than simply aggressive.
I think there's basically black versus white and not a lot of grey. And that's really, my world is not pushing grey, but it's also saying, is that really white or is it really black? And just have another look at it. And but what I really want people to do is to read my pieces and think about something. And then if they still think what they thought before, but have actually just considered why they thought that, then I've achieved something. And if they've changed their view, then I've achieved something. How effective it is, I cannot say. But, basically, why do we put all our wine in 75 centiliter bottles? Why shouldn't we have smaller bottles? And this week I'm looking at, there's a thing about whether AI bots can recommend wine as successfully as human beings. You stop thinking, right, so hold on a second. Firstly, how many people ever get a real recommendation from a real human being who knows what they're doing? Oh, you get in restaurants. Most people don't go to those sort of restaurants. Number one. But secondly, the thing about wine is it's a convivial beverage that usually is consumed by 2 or 3 or 4 people. And actually having somebody say, oh, Robert, I understand you deeply, and I know that the wine you are really going to enjoy. It's not going to be of much help to the other people around the table. And, the whole recommendation thing is very much a one-on-one. It's, Robert, we can decide what you, Stuart, we're going to like to drink, but you aren't going to drink this by yourself. And I think those are the questions that we need to ask ourselves.
That's the kind of questions that you're asking in your weekly Devil's Advocate.
And in essentially the 2 books that are coming out this year.
Yep. So I want to move the conversation on to those 2 books, Robert, and Wine Thinking and Wine People. Have I got that right? Yep. And the first, Wine Thinking, is this collection, am I right, of articles from Meininger's.
It's 2 years from Meininger's International where the Devil's Advocate pieces appear, with little introductory pieces by me in which I then say, this is what I said 10 years ago. Look how wrong I was. Or indeed, I was right about this, but maybe not quite. It didn't turn out quite the way I saw, or whatever. So I think it's quite interesting. It's a way of looking back at the last 20 years, because I think that history is very useful when you're looking at where we're going in the future. And I've really enjoyed doing that and the range of topics that it covers. And you can dip in and out.
And has that been released yet?
Not yet, and they're both coming out more or less in tandem. It wasn't the original plan, but they're both coming out really sort of after the summer.
Okay. And the second has
The Wine People,
an AI twist?
completely different idea, and that is based on a concept, and I'm really, really no idea. It just goes against everything I think in terms of wine. We should think about who something's for. And I'm not entirely sure, actually I'm not entirely sure who either book is for, if I'm really honest about it, but I hope I've got some ideas on that. But this is just me waking up one day, looking at the wine world and thinking about all of the players. It's thinking about a movie. You go and see the Oscars and you see all these awards that are being given to the person who did the costumes, the person who did the makeup, the person who did the music, the person who did the casting, stuff that we pay no attention to, the editor and so on. And that fascinates me because making a movie is not just a few actors and a director and a cameraman. There's a lot that gets behind it. And in wine, the same thing applies. The label that inspired you to buy the wine was not designed by the winemaker usually. The winemaker may have decided what we're trying to use. But there was a label designer. The website looks the way it does because somebody made it look that way. The communication that happens, the style of wine, the way the grapes are grown. And there's so many different elements in there. And so I thought, let's bring all these people together. And there's this 200 people. They've all got names. They're personas. None of them exist. None of them are flesh and blood. But they're there. They are literary characters, if you like, in a scenario. And 30 odd of them are wine drinkers. But different people drink wine in different ways for different reasons in different circumstances. And again, I think the wine industry doesn't necessarily appreciate that, and we kind of imagine that everybody wants to know what the terroir, or everybody wants to know what this or that. No, they're all different. They're all buying wine for different reasons, and the people selling it, the people making it, they're all different. So there's 200 of them, and in fact, the book starts with a I would say it's a short story, but it's basically a 24-hour scenario in which a number of these 200 people meet each other. They don't meet each other, but they interact, and you hopefully get an idea from that. Of what a web it is, and how they each, or you could say jigsaw puzzle or whatever, how all these pieces fit with each other.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely fascinating, and I'm looking forward to seeing the end result in the autumn when that's published. You are a prolific wine writer, and you have been for many years now, with more than 25 books, I think, to your credit, an incredible back catalogue. So I'm going to ask you about your writing habits. How do you get in the mood to write? Where do you write? How often do you write? When you're writing a book or a column, how do you get into that? And what advice would you give to aspiring wine writers who might be listening?
Well, there's two different kinds of wine writers. There's the wine writer who is a wine, what they call wine critic, who just they're in the business of recommending wines, and the answer is write a note on every wine you taste, and so and then listen and go and meet as many people as possible, and listen to them. Don't talk at them, listen to them. That's what I as a wine writer did. But I was trying then, what interested me was the stories behind the wines. How did this man or woman come to making this wine rather than that wine for us? I think as a more general wine writer, which is what I am now, as an analyst, ask why. I think, I switched from being a wine critic to a wine writer 20 years ago when my son was born. And for many years, I used to say that he was my greatest influence, because as a small kid, he would say why, and he'd say, and then why, and then why, and why. And I think we don't do that enough. We don't ask enough questions. And I think what journalism is about is doing the who, what, when, where, why, how. And wine, there's a lot of wine writing, but not a lot of wine journalism. And I think that we need more wine journalism. We need more people. I think the wine industry would benefit a lot more from more good wine journalism and less quote unquote wine writing. And the difference is if you read what you've written and you then ask yourself, if this were an advertorial for a region or a wine, how happy would the regional producer be? If they would say, if they would be really happy with it, you've got to say, well, what have you just done? Have you just done a bit of PR for that region or that producer?
Yeah, okay.
Interesting what you say about the impact of becoming a father or your son. I know from my own experience, my background is in history, and I would be always writing about war and conflict and partisans, and my kids would always ask me, what are you writing about, Daddy? Why are you always writing about war? So at a certain point I decided, well, I have to write about something different, because my kids are always asking, why am I always writing about war?
Yeah.
So I decided to write about football, and that's what my next book's about, which is almost as divisive as war, but not quite.
Yeah. But I think what's interesting there is you've alluded to it. One of the handicaps of the wine industry is we've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of appellations, most of which have got very little reason to exist, other than the fact that the people in that village wanted to have but exactly the same as a football team. And there's some ludicrous number of football teams in Italy. I can't remember how many it is. And, to say to any village, you can't have that team, or the town, you can't have it. No, you can't take it away. And to say to the people, you can't have that wine appellation or DOC or DOCG. They'd be very upset. But, the number of people who turn out to watch some of those village teams is very small.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to a lot of those wine DOCs.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I know from my own experience being involved in my kids' village football team, it's almost unsustainable because there are so few kids, but the prospect of merging with the next village team is absolutely unthinkable, even though it would make much more sense from a logical point of view. Okay, that's writing. What about reading? What are you reading for pleasure? What kind of books are on your bedside?
All sorts of, I love all sorts of books, and I try to read about 3 books at the same time, which is a bit of a problem. And then I can't even remember what they are. There are, I think, in a sense, the latest easiest thing was a Mick Herron British spy book, and I love the wry humor that lies behind that. But I think that in terms of writing, whatever it is and whatever it's about, it just has to, and that's what all writing is about. And O. Henry, the short story writer, gave the best advice for any writer, fictional and non-fictional, which was there are only 2. Read a sentence or read a paragraph, and then there's only 2 questions. And then what happened, because that sentence or that paragraph was so interesting, you wanted to know what followed, or so what. And if ever you've written a line or a paragraph that says, people in Belgium actually like wearing beige. Yeah, okay. I'm not very interested in that. You've got to find a way of making me, the reader, saying, basically, across Europe, everybody likes red, but the Belgians like beige. Okay. The next paragraph is going to tell me why the Belgians like beige.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to carry on. And that's what writing to me is about. It is a form of seduction. It is a form of flirting with the reader. The only problem is in the flirting, you can see the effect that the words that you've used are having. And in writing, you can't. But you're imagining that somebody's read that and gone, okay, I want to know about the beigeness.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And your bedside table sounds a little bit like mine, and there's got far too many books and far too many that are in progress. One that has just been added to my pile, I haven't started reading it yet, is The Last American Road Trip by Sarah Kendzior, the New York Times bestselling author of the new Hiding in Plain Sight and The View from Flyover Country. So that's one that I'm really looking for in Hannah.
I'd be very up for that.
particularly in the context of what's happening in America.
The people I like best to talk to about books are the people who actually have a broad range of reading and will, they'll read history and they'll read fiction, science fiction, biographies, whatever, without necessary. And indeed in wine, there are people who I know who love wine, are very expert in wine, but have no interest in spirits and beer and other things, which is fine, and they're terrific in wine. But actually, I love people who can also switch and talk to me about
Something else.
vodka and beer.
Yeah, absolutely. Variety is the spice of life. Okay, so you've got these two books in the pipeline. You're heavily involved in production, consultancy, and judging. What's next? Is there anything new or exciting?
There'll be a different wine nick this year. We did a rosé for the first time in Georgia last year. We're going to do, I think, and can try and do an ambitious pet nat this year. We'll see if it works. We're starting to do a 0 alcohol in France, and I'm going to look at doing an 8% in France. Keep doing different things. And I haven't got the next book in view, but I think there is one slightly bubbling in the background. But I think, essentially, I have huge respect for people who go on doing the same thing over and over again and better and better and better. And my own, my wiring, if you like, it attracts me to people who are looking at doing different things and exploring and experimenting and creating.
And where can our listeners follow you? Where can they get hold of your books? Where's it?
Easy thing to do is I'm winethinker.com on that's my website, and then look me up, Robert Joseph, on LinkedIn, and if you look me up on Wikipedia, it'll say Robert Joseph Wine Connoisseur, which is where we came in. Otherwise, you'll find The Politician. And I mean, the great thing about social media is if you're looking, no one's very hard to find.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert, that was a very brisk canter through what has been, I think, an incredible career and life in wine writing and the broader world of wine.
Yeah.
We're not quite at the obituary stage yet. I'm sure there's plenty more to come, but really, really fascinating to speak to you. And I think we could have continued the conversation much longer, but I'm conscious that you have got other...
I've got some wines so much, and a great chat, and thank you for the research you put into it.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Until next time, guys, thanks for listening.
Thanks.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on Book Club with the Italian Wine Podcast. Tune in again next month when we'll get between the vines with another great wine book. Remember, our show notes, including full details of all the books we've discussed today, are available at italianwinepodcast.com or wherever you get them.